Caterina Sforza. The name itself sort of conjures these images of Renaissance Italy, doesn't it? A noble woman, Countess of Forlì, Lady of Imola. Her life, roughly 1463 to 1509, was just packed with these incredibly bold, sometimes, well, impulsive actions.
Absolutely. And it seems like so much of it was driven by this fierce need to protect her lands, her family. She really fought for what she saw as hers.
Her story is just fascinating because the material we have paints such a complex picture. There are her letters, diplomatic reports, even her own notes on alchemy and medicine.
It's a really rich mix, gives us lots of angles.
Right. So the idea here is to try and really understand the essence of Caterina Sforza. What were the key events, the motivations that made her such a standout figure of her time? Maybe we should start at the beginning with her origins.
Yeah, her beginnings are definitely revealing. Born in Milan, 1463, she was illegitimate, daughter of Galeazzo Maria Sforza, the Duke of Milan, and his mistress, Lucrezia Landriani.
But what's interesting is that her mother, Lucrezia, actually stayed involved in her life, didn't she? That feels a bit unusual for the period.
It does, somewhat. Often the mother would just fade into the background. But Caterina was brought to the Sforza court after her father became duke in 66.
And her upbringing there was quite significant, raised by her paternal grandmother, Bianca Maria Visconti, initially.
Yes, and later adopted by her father's wife, Bona of Savoy. Both seem to have been really strong influences.
Because Bianca Maria Visconti, she was a powerhouse in her own right, wasn't she? Not just a figurehead.
Oh, absolutely. From her grandmother, Caterina seems to have gotten this real pride in her Sforza military heritage, that warlike spirit, and also a grounding in how government actually worked.
And Bona of Savoy. What was her influence?
Well, Bona had her own apothecary, so it's possible Caterina got an early exposure to botanical remedies, that sort of thing. And apparently she also developed a real love for hunting on the family estates.
So it sounds like a fairly rounded, if maybe unconventional, education for a noblewoman back then. Humanistic studies at court, too, I gather.
Yes, exposed to writers, artists, the whole court environment.
Okay, moving forward a bit. 1473, she's betrothed to Girolamo Riario. He was Pope Sixtus V's nephew. They actually married in 1477. That must have been a huge step up in terms of influence.
A massive step. It made her Lady of Imola, instantly linking her to the Milanese court of her birth and, crucially, to the Roman court. When she arrived in Rome in 77, she landed right in the middle of this incredibly vibrant cultural scene.
Rome was really buzzing then, artistically and architecturally.
Exactly. And she wasn't just, a passive observer. Accounts suggest she fitted right into Roman aristocratic circles. People admired her looks, her elegance.
But she was more than just a socialite, right? She played a political role.
She did. She became this important go-between, a link connecting Rome with other Italian courts, especially Milan, her home turf. And her husband, Girolamo, his power just soared under Pope Sixtus. He eventually became Lord of Forlì as well.
And during this time, they had children.
6 children together, yes. Ottaviano, Cesare, Bianca, Giovanni Livio, Galeazzo, and Francesco, known as Sforzino.
But then, things took a turn. Pope Sixtus IV died in 1484. And this is where we really start to see Caterina's boldness emerge. Tell us about Castel Sant'Angelo.
Right. This is quite something. The Pope dies, creating this power vacuum. And Caterina, despite being 7 months pregnant, gets on her horse, rides across the Tiber, and occupies the Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress controlling access to the Vatican in her husband's name.
Wow. 7 months pregnant. She basically held the key to the Vatican.
Pretty much. It gave her enormous leverage over the cardinals who were about to elect the next pope. They were apparently very nervous about even holding the funeral or the conclave with their cannons potentially aimed at them. It really shook things up, A woman asserting that kind of direct political power was not the norm.
How did that play out? What was her demand?
Her position was clear. Pope Sixtus had given the fortress to her family, and she'd only hand it over to the new pope once elected. The cardinals tried to negotiate, offered Girolamo confirmation of his lordships, money to leave Rome.
But she resisted.
Initially, yes. She seemed more determined than Girolamo, actually. She even brought in more soldiers. He eventually agreed to the terms, and she had to give up the fortress, apparently quite reluctantly.
Still, what a statement. It shows her willingness to jump right into the political fire.
Absolutely. After that, they went back to Forlì. But Girolamo wasn't popular there. He raised taxes, which, never goes down well. Discontent grew.
Leading to conspiracies.
Exactly. And in 1488, he was assassinated. Caterina and her children were captured and imprisoned by the conspirators.
That must have been terrifying. A widow, her children hostages, held by her husband's murderers.
A desperate situation. But this is where the legend really takes shape. She was imprisoned in the fortress of Ravaldino. She managed to talk her way inside, supposedly to persuade the castle commander to surrender, leaving her children behind as collateral.
But once inside,
Once inside, she completely turned the tables, started issuing threats, refusing to surrender.
and this is where the famous story comes in, about her claiming to be pregnant, or maybe even gesturing defiantly from the ramparts, though that last part might be more legend than fact.
Well, the accounts do say she claimed she was pregnant. Whether true or a bluff, it was strategically brilliant. It meant even if they killed her current children, she potentially carried another heir. This apparently made the Orsi family, the main conspirators, hesitate.
Agree. Clever.
And she eventually regained control.
Yes, with help from her uncle, Ludovico il Moro in Milan, she managed to defeat the rebels and secure her position.
And then she became regent for her eldest son, Ottaviano, a woman ruling Forlì. That couldn't have been easy in that society.
No, definitely not. Female regents were often viewed with suspicion, seen as temporary placeholders. But Caterina wasn't temporary. She took charge. Her first priority, avenging Girolamo's death, then consolidating her power.
So she was hands-on, managing everything. Completely. Diplomacy, arranging marriages for her children, controlling the economy, even overseeing the training of her militia. She was involved in every detail.
And Forlì and Imola, though small, were in a tricky spot geographically, weren't they?
Very tricky. Strategically vital. Caught between bigger powers. She had to navigate the rise of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, and then the French invasion under Charles VIII. She tried neutrality at first, but had to constantly shift alliances to survive.
While dealing with all that, she also remarried, secretly, to Giacomo Feo in 1488. That sounds like it added another layer of complexity.
It did. It seems it was a passionate match, but Feo wasn't noble and he wasn't liked. People worried she'd favor him over her son Ottaviano, the rightful heir.
And Feo himself caused problems.
Apparently, he became quite cruel and arrogant, which fueled resentment. Plots started forming against him, and maybe against Caterina, too. In 1495, he was ambushed and killed.
And Caterina's reaction to this assassination.
It was ferocious, utterly brutal. She unleashed this wave of vengeance, not just against the assassins, but their entire families. Women, children, anyone connected was targeted.
That sounds incredibly harsh, even for the time.
It was extreme. While maybe understandable in terms of the violence of the era, it badly damaged her reputation, lost her a lot of support among her own subjects.
After all that turmoil, she married again to Giovanni de' Medici il Popolano in 1497.
Yes, a third marriage. This one seems to have been different. Reports suggest real affection between them. Giovanni was apparently liked by her children, by her uncle Ludovico.
And they had a son together.
They did. Ludovico, who grew up to be the famous condottiero Giovanni della Bandiera, a renowned military leader in his own right.
But happiness seemed short-lived for Caterina. Giovanni died just a year later in 1498.
Tragically short, yes, leaving her alone again, facing even bigger storms gathering on the horizon, specifically Cesare Borgia.
Ah, the Borgias. This is when she earns her nickname La Tigre, the Tigress.
Exactly. She was fighting to defend her lands against Venice, and then Cesare Borgia, Pope Alexander VI's son, set his sights on them. Louis XII of France backed Borgia, and the Pope issued a decree saying her family's claim to Forlì and Imola was invalid.
But she wouldn't just give them up.
Absolutely not. She refused point blank to surrender Imola and Forlì to Borgia. She prepared for war.
Famously making her stand at the fortress of Ravellino in Forlì.
That's right. She sealed herself inside and prepared to resist. The siege began in late 1499.
And her defense became legendary, didn't it? People across Italy were watching.
They were. She held out for months against Borgia's army. Her determination, her sheer grit, it really captured people's imagination. Even her enemies reportedly admired her spirit. Machiavelli wrote about it.
But ultimately, the fortress couldn't hold indefinitely.
No. In January 1500, after heavy bombardment, Borgia's forces breached the walls. Caterina kept fighting, but was eventually captured. Interestingly, she chose to surrender to the French commander, wanting to be a prisoner of France rather than Cesare Borgia.
Smart move, perhaps. What happened to her then? Imprisonment.
Yes. First, she was held somewhat leniently in the Belvedere Palace in Rome, but later she was moved to the Castel San Angelo, the same fortress she had once occupied.
Full circle. And wasn't there an accusation that she tried to poison Pope Alexander?
There was a very serious charge, using poisoned letters, supposedly. Whether it was true or just a pretext by the Borgias is still debated. The trial was inconclusive.
How did she get out?
Eventually, the French army intervened, the same ones she surrendered to. She was released in mid-1501, apparently after formally renouncing her claims to Forlì and Imola.
So her final years were spent away from her lands. In Florence.
Mostly, yes. Life in Florence. It seems she struggled financially for a time, and she had to fight a legal battle against Lorenzo de' Medici, a relative of her late husband Giovanni, for custody of their son Giovanni.
Did she win custody?
She did, eventually. In 1504, she regained guardianship. But her hopes of ever getting back Forlì and Imola faded. She seems to have focused her energy on her children, especially young Giovanni.
And this is also the period where we hear more about her other pursuits. The alchemy, the experiments.
Exactly. This is a whole other fascinating side to her. She dedicated a lot of time to experiments in, well, a whole range of things. Alchemy, cosmetics, medicine. She compiled them all in this manuscript called Gli Experimenti.
What kind of things were in?
Hundreds of recipes. Seriously, everything from making perfumes and skin creams to medical remedies for illnesses. And yes, classic alchemical goals like the elixir of life, the philosopher's stone. She even had medicinal gardens back in Forlì. It shows this incredible intellectual curiosity.
Trying to blend science, beauty, medicine, even the mystical. And she was interested in specific materials like talc.
The manuscript mentions talc quite a bit, yes, used across cosmetic, medicinal, and perhaps even alchemical recipes. It shows a real hands-on approach to materials. This book, Gli Experimenti, was treasured and passed down through the Medici family, which tells you something about its perceived value.
So she was a political leader, a military figure, and an amateur scientist or proto-chemist. Quite the combination. She died in Florence, didn't she?
Yes, in 1509, pneumonia was the cause. Her burial was fairly simple, and sadly, her grave was lost during later renovations to the convent.
When we think about her, what does she actually look like, and what was her personality really like? The descriptions seem a bit contradictory.
They really do. Some contemporaries called her beautiful, but maybe reserved, spoke little. Others, like the chronicler Sanudo, called her basically a virago, fierce, even cruel. There's one odd report calling her ugly, but the medals minted with her profile suggest otherwise, showing quite strong features. Later in life, she apparently became quite stout, which ran in the Sforza family.
So a complex image physically and personality-wise. The words that come up are strong-willed, spirited, proud, cunning, bold.
All of those fit. Forceful, definitely militant when necessary, impetuous sometimes. And she clearly had intense feelings. Her love affairs were numerous and apparently quite passionate, sometimes with men considered below her station. These relationships sometimes seem to influence her political decisions, too.
It's no wonder she still pops up in fiction novels, TV shows, even video games. Her life story is just so dramatic.
It really is. She's a character that writers and creators are drawn to. Of course, these portrayals often take liberties, but they show her enduring fascination as this powerful, unconventional woman.
And we have to mention Machiavelli again. His account of her, especially that defiance at Ravaldino, is maybe the most famous image we have. But you mentioned it might be embellished.
It seems likely. The specific detail Machiavelli includes about her supposedly lifting her skirts and gesturing towards her children, claiming she could make more, isn't found in other contemporary accounts of the siege. Those tend to focus more on her strategic thinking and her courage.
So why would Machiavelli write it that way?
Well, Machiavelli often used historical anecdotes to illustrate his political points. Perhaps that dramatic, almost crude defiance fitted the image he wanted to project of a ruthless, pragmatic leader, or maybe just made for a better story. Whatever his reasons, his version really stuck and heavily influenced how people saw her, this incredibly defiant, almost shocking figure.
Interesting how one account can shape a legacy. Someone compared her to Isabella I of Castile, noting that Caterina often gets a harsher judgment in history.
That's a point Antonia Fraser made, yes. Maybe because Isabella's actions were often framed by religious piety, whereas Caterina's were seen as more about secular power, protecting her lands, her inheritance, her children. Even her acts of cruelty, like the revenge after Giacomo Feo's death, while brutal, weren't necessarily unique for rulers of that time, but her motivations were interpreted differently.
So beyond the politics and warfare, her legacy also includes this intellectual side, the experimenti.
I think so. Her thirst for knowledge, her practical experiments, and what we'd now maybe call early pharmacology or chemistry, that's a significant aspect. And of course, her lineage continued. Through her son, Giovanni da Bandinare, she's an ancestor of Cosimo I de' Medici, the future Grand Duke of Tuscany, and therefore connected to many later European royal families.
What a life. Caterina Sforza really stands out, doesn't she? Resilience, political smarts, that independent streak, all playing out in such a turbulent time.
Absolutely. And you're left with these fascinating contrasts and, frankly, some mysteries. How much of the Machiavelli story is true?
When you think about her story today, what resonates for me, it's perhaps just that sheer force of will, a woman carving out and defending her power in a world really not designed for that. It makes you think about the challenges women in power faced then and maybe still face now, right?